Hello, everyone. Juxtaposition here. Today's video will be entitled George von Mohrenschildt. George de Mohrenschildt. He changed his name from von Mohrenschildt to the French version, de Mohrenschildt. He was German Scottish from his father's side, and he's Hungarian Polish from his mother's side. This is the other George, George Herbert Walker Bush, Poppy, Poppy Bush, son of Prescott Bush. The reason I'm featuring him is that Zoom wouldn't permit me to have a full picture of George de Mohrenschildt, who was murdered essentially at the behest of George Herbert Walker Bush. Um, Although I do think there's a higher authority in Switzerland who sanctioned the murder, the murder by 20 gauge shotgun blast to his head. George de Mohrenschildt killed in Palm Beach County, Florida, in a $25 million home on the second floor, directly above the kitchen, where the maid didn't hear a damn thing. All right. So, anyway, George Bush was the director of CIA at the time that George de Mohrenschildt had his head blown off. And they had corresponded in writing, and there are letters to document that George de Mohrenschildt had mailed the CIA director, George Bush, a handwritten letter on September 5th. It arrived on September 5th, 1976. And then there was some kind of a discussion there going on at CIA concerning how to handle George de Mohrenschildt, who was already under 24/7 surveillance by the FBI and CIA for at least a year prior to that. George de Mohrenschildt was writing a book, and he had a draft essay of what is entitled I'm a Patsy, I'm a Patsy, regarding the story of Lee Harvey Oswald. And so once he began writing down his thoughts about the fact that Lee Oswald was not guilty in the murder of Jack Kennedy, he went under 24/7 surveillance. George de Mohrenschildt was ensconced as a professor at Bishop University. He was living exactly 1 mile to the east of Parkland Hospital, 1 mile exactly, in a apartment number 2737 Kings Road. You will remember my video from Jack Cassidy. He was murdered on Kings Road at 1212 Kings Road. That's a 33. Jack Cassidy was ensconced on the penthouse suite, number 33. Apartment number 33. Jack Cassidy was incinerated in his foyer, not in a Naugahyde sofa like the media told you. He was found dead in the front of his apartment at the front door on the tile floor, incinerated on Kings Road. And guess what? At the time of the murder of George de Mohrenschildt, he was residing at 2737 Kings Road in Dallas, Texas, 1 mile east of Parkland Hospital. You do know that Jack Kennedy, after he was confirmed dead at Dealey Plaza, was then driven to Parkland Hospital on Highway 13. It's technically called Texas State Highway 35E. If you do the math on E is the fifth letter of the alphabet, and you'd have a 3 plus 5 plus 5 is 13. And so Jack Kennedy, who is, of course, murdered 33 months into his presidency on a November 22nd, 1963 date, which is a 33 date, and he was killed in a 666-999 kill zone on a three-sided pyramid called George Dealey Plaza, which was pre-selected years before they decided to use it to kill JFK. But anyway, you know that George Herbert Walker Bush, who's in this picture behind my shoulder, he was present. And he also was associated with the CIA straw company known as Zapata Oil. They're located on the second floor of 501 Elm Street, which is directly behind where Jack Kennedy's head was blown off. In a 7-story office building where Abraham Zapruder worked on the fourth and fifth floors of the same exact building that George Herbert Walker Bush worked. You should know that George W. Bush, age 16, he was present for the murder of Jack Kennedy. Also, he was seen in photographs looking at the Dallas police motorcycles, and George H.W. Bush was seen on the corner of Elm Street and Houston. In fact, directly in front of the school book depository building, which afforded him rather direct shot to a view of the shooters directly in front of him on the railroad triple underpass there at Main Street. The killers, the people that shot Jack Kennedy. Two shots came from over Main Street on the railroad trestle. Anyway, just thought you should know that as a little bit of background. But George de Mohrenschildt grew up in a royalty family in Belarus, Russia. They were booted out, had their business confiscated by the government. Businesses were nationalized, and then they fled to Poland. And at no time was George de Mohrenschildt anything other than an intelligence operative from teenage year on. George de Mohrenschildt was always involved with military intelligence, and he worked for Polish and French intelligence. Then he worked for the OSS. Then he worked for the CIA under the tutelage here of George Herbert Walker Bush. Any discussion that you have that George Bush didn't know George de Mohrenschildt is a bald-faced lie. They've known each other for 2/3 of their entire lives. I think they met when George Bush met George de Mohrenschildt in 1938. Okay, before World War II, George de Mohrenschildt was living with his older brother Dmitri in Long Island, New York, and that's when he was dating Jackie Kennedy's aunt in Manhattan, New York. And George de Mohrenschildt knew Jackie Kennedy, who was 9 years old, and George de Mohrenschildt was 27 years old. He was dating Jackie's aunt. He was familiar with Jackie Bouvier's mother also. He would have known Prescott Bush, who he got employment from. Prescott Bush is the father here of George Herbert Walker Bush. So not only does George Herbert Walker Bush know George de Mohrenschildt, so does his father, and so does almost every person who George Bush works for in the oil business and in intelligence business. So I'm telling you that George de Mohrenschildt worked for CIA, OSS, French intelligence, Polish intelligence, and probably some kind of Russian intelligence beforehand, or his father did. But Demetria worked directly for Wild Bill Donovan, who was the head of the OSS during World War II. And Demetria worked for Bill Donovan in Manhattan, New York. And he's the older brother of George de Mohrenschildt, who moved in with Dmitri Mohrenschildt in Long Island in 1938, living in New York. You should know that George de Mohrenschildt had a very busy life. He was married and divorced 4 times during his life. And his last wife, he had 3 children. He had a son and 2 daughters. His eldest child, the son, was born, I don't have a date on that, but he was born on the first wife, and he died of cystic fibrosis. And then he had another daughter who died under mysterious circumstances. And in and around 1975-76, his daughter died. And then he had his youngest daughter, Alexandra, who survived. And his last wife was Jean de Mohrenschildt. Now, they were divorced in 1973. However, they were still living together at 2737 Kings Road in Dallas. Despite being divorced for 4 years, they're still living together. Jean has power of attorney and medical proxy for George. And when September 5th, 1976 came, and a handwritten letter was received by the CIA in Langley, Virginia, addressed to George H.W. Bush, it was decided that George DeMornshield should receive 9 electroshock treatments at Parkland Hospital. Parkland Hospital is the one that was involved with Jack Kennedy, who was already dead before he got there. They were involved with Lee Harvey Oswald, who probably wasn't dead but was euthanized at Parkland. They were involved with giving 9 electroshock treatments to George DeMornshield after he wrote and posted the letter to the CIA director, George H.W. Bush. He was given 9 electroshock treatments. Does that sound like Ted Kaczynski to you? It does to me. Everything about these murders, all of them, they all relate, you know. George DeMornshield was a lifelong dedicated soldier to the military intelligence, and he never really ran into any problems until he wanted to write a book about Lee Harvey Oswald being a patsy and not being the actual killer of John Kennedy. Everything besides that was golden in his life. And you should know that he came to Long Beach to live with Dimitri, his older brother, who's working for Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the CIA. That back then it was the Office of Special Services, and Bill Donovan was also working at a law firm in Manhattan, New York, and was the head of the OSS. So that you can't get any higher security clearance than Dimitri de Mohrenschildt. And there is his younger brother, George. Now, George later did apply for employment at the OSS and was rejected. That said, he was accepted because he never worked anywhere except the CIA and the OSS from his 27th birthday. He only worked for intelligence community. So that's part of his cover story, is that they rejected him, when the reality is they sent him to Mexico City, they sent him to Caracas, Venezuela, they sent him to Haiti. Goes all around the world, including Asia, on an expense account with the CIA the entire time, where they say they disavow any knowledge of him, and yet they are sponsoring his travels throughout the world. So it starts out in Long Island, and he's dating Jackie Bouvier's aunt. Then he dabbles in the insurance industry from 1939 to 1941. The only little problem is that he has no insurance license, and he flunked the insurance exam. So I'm just wondering how you can conduct yourself for 3 years in the insurance industry when you're unlicensed. But this was a cover story for the OSS. He's working for the OSS, but they're pretending he's an insurance agent, unlicensed. He then moves to Film Facts, a production company back east, in 1941, where he's involved in the production of propaganda films for about a year. He is then moved to Mexico City, where he works with William F. Buckley, whose family's in the oil business in Venezuela and in Mexico. You know, William F. Buckley went to Yale University. George DeMornshield is 100% controlled by Yaleys. Prescott Bush approves the employment of both Dimitri and George DeMornshield. He is then a cohort and is about the same age as George Herbert Walker Bush, who becomes the CIA director. He's friends with him. He knows George W. Bush Jr. He knows him like sort of a nephew of his. He knows Clint Murchison, who owns the Dallas Cowboys and many oil wells in Texas. Clint Murchison Jr. I'm pretty sure he knows Clint Murchison Sr. also. They're the ones that hosted the cocktail party the evening before Jack Kennedy had his head blown off in Dallas. There was a big party at the Murchison Mansion, and George DeMornshield is personal friends with Clint Murchison Sr. and Clint Murchison Jr., who he's had a business relationship with since 1952. So at the time of Jack Kennedy's murder, George DeMornshield already had an 11-year relationship with the man who hosted the cocktail party on the Thursday night before Jack Kennedy was killed at 12:30 p.m. local time on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. George DeMornshield, George Bush Jr. were all in Dallas, and they all must have gone to that party. Not sure about George W., Richard Nixon went to that party, and J. Edgar Hoover went to that party, and J. Edgar Hoover's gay lover, Clyde Tolston, he went to that party. So I don't see any reason why George Bush Jr. couldn't have gone. He was only 16. Anyway, people also involved with George DeMarshall's final days was Edward J. Epstein. I said Epstein, no relation to Jeffrey Epstein. He is a Yale alum. He went to Cornell and then he went and got a PhD from Yale. And he is a contractor for the CIA, and he works for Reader's Digest magazine. And he booked a 4-day interview with George DeMarshall to be paid $1,000 per day. It's very important that you understand the dates here. Tuesday, March 29th, 1977 was the first day at the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida, for interviewing. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, George DeMarshall would be paid $4,000 for 4 days of interviews regarding George DeMarshall's biographical account of his life in Europe, to his trek to Long Island, New York, to his trek to Mexico City, Venezuela, sort of a biographical interview, to include his relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. But the purpose of the 4 days was to really do a biography of his life. Now, you know that Edward J. Epstein works for the CIA, right? So it's more of a interrogation than it is interview. But in any case, if you believe that George DeMarshall is suicidal, I got a bridge to sell you. San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. I'll sell it to you for $50 a month. All right, forever. You just pay me $50 a month for the rest of your life, and yeah, you can have the Golden Gate Bridge. How's that? Anyway, Edward J. Epstein is rented a room at the Breakers Hotel. If you haven't been there, it's an extremely expensive hotel on the Atlantic Ocean, off of Highway 1A1, also known as the Jimmy Buffett Boulevard. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that they had a morning session from 9 a.m. until noon. George Marshall was driving a rent-a-car that Edward Epstein rented for him on behalf of Reader Digest magazine. You know that that room was bugged with listening devices, and that based on the 3 hours they did, they took a break at noon. They were to resume at 3 p.m. It's an 8-mile drive from the Breakers Hotel south on Highway 1A1 to get to 1780 South Ocean Boulevard, which is where George DeMarshall and his daughter Alexandra were staying. His daughter was there for 3 months with a friend of hers, and they were staying at Nancy Tilton's gated property. Now, it's completely secure. There's cameras. There's bugs in the rhododendrons. There's a fence line, steel, and a wall, concrete wall, and a steel gate. Back then, it was a 3-story building, a 3-story house with a pool house and a separate 5-car garage. It's been destroyed and rebuilt. So today, it's a 2-story mansion. It's probably worth about $20 million today. Anyway, so it has a boat dock in the back, has a swimming pool and a boat dock in the back. And you should know that the boat dock is part of the inland waterway system. And so any killers of George DeMarshall would have been dropped off by a boat. The boat wouldn't have docked. It would have just dropped them off either at the neighbors on north or south of the 1780 property. I would guess they were dropped next door. Then they climbed around the fence line at the water and then were allowed into the house, where they waited and lied in wait on the 3rd floor. George DeMarshall was murdered in the sitting room den on the 2nd floor, where Nancy Tilton's bedroom is, and also a guest bedroom where George DeMarshall was staying. He'd been on the property since March 11th. He was murdered on the 29th. So if you do the math on that, you know, he's been there for 18 days, 3 weeks. His daughter has been living in this mansion for 3 months. She's been there since December 1976, and it is now March 29th, 1977. Now, if you believe that he's suicidal, then you've got to answer the juxtaposition question of the day, which is, Why wouldn't he kill himself on Friday night or Saturday morning when he had completed the 4 days, collected the $4,000 interview fee, handed the money to his daughter, Alexandra, who he adored, give her the money, then blow your head off with a shotgun that doesn't belong to you, belongs allegedly to Nancy Tilton and was under her bed in her master bedroom, if you believe that. I don't. Anyway, you should know that George de Mohrenschildt arose at 7 a.m. Tuesday morning. He went for a walk on the beach, which is directly across the street, which is 1A1, the Jimmy Buffett Boulevard. Just walk right across the street. There are no homes across the street. There is a cabana pool house. It's gated. It's locked. You have to have a code to get in, and you're on the Atlantic Ocean. It's directly across the street. It's a baseball throw away from Nancy Tilton's front gate. Just walk straight across the street and get past the gate, and you're on the beach. Walk, came back home. They have a live-in cook on the property, and they have a live-in landscaping gardener. Those are the two helps that actually stay overnight on the property. And I have the names of those people, of all the people that are involved here. The live-in cook's name is Lillian Romantic, except it's spelled Romanic, Romantic. Miss Lillian Romantic. She's 56 years old. She's unmarried. We call her Miss Lillian Romantic. And she's a live-in cook. She cooked breakfast for George de Mohrenschildt. Now, Nancy Tilton, she slept in because it appears that George de Mohrenschildt got in the rent-a-car that was rented by Reader Digest and Edward Epstein, and he left to go to the Breakers Hotel around 8:20, 8:30 in the morning. And it wasn't until after George Mohrenschildt left the property to drive north on 1A1 that Nancy Tilton arose and came down to the breakfast room for her breakfast at 9 o'clock. So she's sitting down for breakfast in her own kitchen around the time that George de Mohrenschildt is, meeting and greeting Edward Epstein at the Breakers Hotel lobby. Don't you see a little thing that's sketchy to me here? Is that I see that Nancy Tilton is aware that George de Mohrenschildt is going to be murdered that day, and she doesn't want to look him in the eyes. She deliberately, on purpose, doesn't leave her bedroom, which is on the same floor as his guest room. She knows he's up, and she knows he's had breakfast. And instead of just coming down and wishing him a good day for his interviews, she remains in her room, in her bedroom. And she comes down later. Then she makes damn sure she leaves the house to go play bridge with her friends. And I got an address where she drove away in Palm Beach to go play cards. And she makes damn sure she's not there at lunchtime when they take a break at the Breakers Hotel at noon. And George de Mohrenschildt drives back to the Nancy Tilton estate, which is about, it's 8 miles, and your average speed is going to be about 25 to 30 miles an hour. It is a highway, but it's 2 lane. There's no sidewalk. There's no center line. There is a bike lane, white line on the edge of each side of the road. There's no bike lane per se, however. I've ridden my bicycle past this property twice in my life, going north, making a U-turn at the Breakers, and then returning back to Boca Raton. Boca Raton, Florida is where I was staying at the time when I rode my bike past this property, this murder site. And it is a murder site, it's not a suicide. All right. And it's very instructive to know that Nancy Tilton avoided George de Mohrenschildt on the day that he was to be murdered. So she knew that he was going to be killed in her home. She knew that. I have no doubt about that. Her husband is Charles Elliott Tilton III, and he was in a ranch in Santa Cruz, Arizona. You can Google that. So he made damn sure he wasn't around when this execution happened. Remember, George Mohrenschildt's been on the property for 3 weeks. They could have killed him at any time during those 3 weeks, but they wanted to know what was on his mind, and they had Edward Epstein from Reader Digest ask him some compelling questions for 3 hours. And based upon that, the decision was made the killers can go in and kill him at lunchtime. Anyway, Lillian Romantic made a cheese sandwich, grilled cheese sandwich for for George de Mohrenschildt as his last meal. And then he went upstairs, whereupon he kissed his daughter Alexandra and her friend Catherine Loomis. Neither Alexandra nor Catherine Loomis are married. They both live in Mexico City, but they've been staying with Nancy Tilton, who is the pseudo stepmother of Alexandra, because Alexandra's mother, who was, I believe, first or second of four wives for George, she abandoned ship and fled and was not around for Alexander. So it was Nancy Tilton who stood in and let Alexander stay with her in her various homes throughout the United States. All right, so we have Catherine Loomis and Alexandra. They left to go to Boynton Beach to go shopping for toiletries and other items. So they said goodbye to George de Mohrenschildt at lunchtime. I assume they had lunch also that Lillian Romantic prepared. And they went south, toward Boca Raton. That's where Boynton Beach is, south along the inland waterway on Highway 1A1. This left George de Mohrenschildt alone in the home with Miss Romantic. Now, Miss Romantic went in her bedroom, changed into her bathing suit, went into the backyard to go suntanning by the pool after she had served lunch to Alexandra and Catherine Loomis and George de Mohrenschildt. Nancy Tilton had already left, remember, to go play cards. So Nancy Tilton's not there. Now, we still have the gardener. His name is here somewhere. We have a gardener living on the property. He claims that he was in the backyard doing gardening, allegedly. Now, he lives in a cottage at the 5-car garage at the time. He lives attached to the garage, which is detached from the main home. And there's also a maid. Her name is Anna Visola. Anna Visola. She was the maid, and she says that Nancy Tilton told her to go to her master bedroom and turn on a pre-recorded tape system for the soap operas that Miss Tilton, Nancy Tilton, would miss because she's playing cards with her friends. So Anna Visola said she walked upstairs to the second floor, went into the mistress's room and turned on the recording show, and then returned to the kitchen area. So she's in the kitchen, and after George de Mohrenschildt said goodbye to his daughter Alexandra and Catherine Loomis, he went up to his bedroom. Then, of course, he went into the sitting room den, which is right next to where the maid, Anna Visola. This is like a shot in the dark with Peter Sellers, isn't it? I mean, this is the Bolon mansion. We have two live-ins, but we have the maid, who is not a live-in. She lives in her own apartment in town, but she is just visiting for the day as a maid. And she's in the kitchen at the time. Around 2:45 p.m. is when George de Mohrenschildt blew his brains out, allegedly. He's pushing it kind of tight. He's supposed to be back at the Breakers Hotel at 3. So if he's not going to kill himself, he's going to be needing to get in the rent-a-car. He can make it to the Breakers in 15 minutes for sure. He can do it. It's possible. I'm saying that but it's probably a 15, 20-minute drive. So you'd have to do a little speeding on that narrow road to get there on time. But in any case, he's dead. And you should know that the gardener didn't hear anything, says he's in the backyard. And that Miss Romantic, Lillian Romantic, she's at the pool sunning. She didn't hear anything. But the person closest to George de Mohrenschildt, the room directly below the den, is the kitchen. And Anna Visola says she didn't hear anything. It's a shot in the dark. Nobody sees anything. Nobody hears anything. I'm just telling you, I find this very implausible. There are also two other young women on the property, but they're in the garage area. There's an apartment above the car garage, and they're painting the room because one of the girls lives 3 houses down Ocean Boulevard. She's a neighbor of Nancy Tilton, and Nancy is letting this young woman move into the apartment above her 5-car garage. And I have their names. It's Lori Tisdale is going to be moving in, and she's painting the room with her friend Diane Tisdale, who's her sister. It's 2 sisters. And they say they didn't hear anything either. And they're in the garage, which is where the landscaping guy goes, you know, this house requires a team of landscapers. One man cannot handle it, but there's so much gardening to do there in Palm Beach that you could use a live-in landscaper plus a team who comes a couple days a week because of all the foliage that will need to be taken out because of the humidity and the rain and the wind and the sand. There's so much maintenance to do on this property. You have no idea how much money it costs to maintain these properties on Highway 1A1, aka Jimmy Buffett Freeway. All right, so what I wanted to tell you is that we've got Lori Tillsdale, Diane Tillsdale. Then I have I've got Anna Visola, who's the maid, Lillian Romanek, who's the cook. Then I have the gardener, who I can't find his name, but I know I have it here somewhere. The live-in gardener. His name is Mr. Coley Wimpley. Coley Wimpley is on the property. He claims he's in the backyard, must be with the sun tanning cook, Lillian Romantic, right? So you have clearly, if someone had come up with a boat and dropped the killers off, then in theory, right, Lillian Romantic would have seen the boat and the murderers, and so too would the yard man, Coley Wimpley. He would have seen them too, right? But they didn't. They didn't hear any gunshots from a 20 gauge shotgun. It was just a 47-inch long weapon. That's almost 4 feet long, a 4 feet long weapon. George DeMarcia was wearing his shoes, meaning he didn't use his big toe to pull the trigger. And I'm just telling you, as a practical matter, I would like to prove this with a 47-inch shotgun that even if you're 6 feet tall, you have a difficult time reaching the trigger with your thumb and pulling it. It would be very difficult. So I'm saying that he didn't do that, that someone else pulled the trigger, and that someone else would have been the shooter or the murderer, who would have been having two men, and they probably medicated and doped George Mohrenschildt so that he was pacified sitting in a high back chair in the den on the second floor, not far from Nancy Tilton's master bedroom. When the police came, they did check for latent fingerprints, but the police report won't tell you where they checked. They checked the windows to see if any windows were open. I'm saying that the killers were allowed into the house, probably by the maid or by Lillian Romantic, right? In other words, the help is always in on the kill. If you watched Shot in the Dark with Peter Sellers, you'll know that every person that lived in the Bolon mansion was involved with felony crimes. Every single one of them, whether it was extortion or whether it was murder or whether it was concealment or murder. The home was full of murderers and extortionists, and they were all adulterous, including Maria Gambrelli, who was not involved in felony crimes, but she was involved with adultery, okay, which is not a crime, but she was involved with that. All right, so I have a lot of minutia here. I will post links to all the players involved, but certainly Yale University is implicated in the murder of George Mohrenschildt. Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, Clint Murchison, William Oltmann, who is from the Netherlands. He went to Yale, didn't graduate, but he did attend Yale for a while. He's Dutch. He went on television and told everyone what George Mohrenschildt had told him, which is a bald-faced lie. Said that Lee Oswald definitely killed Jack Kennedy. That is not true. Edward J. Epstein, he's a bald-faced liar. He lured the victim to the Breakers Hotel for his last 3 hours of surveillance, then sent him to be killed back at Nancy Tilton's house. Nancy Tilton is implicated in the murder of George Mohrenschildt. Her husband, Charles Elliott Tilton III, he's implicated by his very absence, that he's getting out of town because he doesn't want to be involved with the felony murder of George Mohrenschildt, whose daughter has been living in his home for 3 months. The CIA is involved. Richard Helms is involved. This is happening on March 29th, 1977. George Mohrenschildt was expected to testify to the House Select Assassination Committee in Washington, D.C. That was coming up. It's very obvious that along with Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, who were also testifying to that same committee, see that George Mohrenschildt met with the very same fate that Sam Giancana did and the very same fate that Johnny Roselli did in Dumbfounding Bay, Biscayne Bay, Miami. So we have George Mohrenschildt, Johnny Roselli killed fairly similar ways. And Johnny Roselli was garroted, then had his legs sawed off with a hacksaw, placed into a 55-gallon drum and dumped into Biscayne Bay, which is 20 miles south of where George Mohrenschildt had his head blown off with a 20-gauge shotgun. But that's not much different than Sam Giancana, who was shot once in the back of the head and then 6 times into his face, 7 times to his head. That's not different than George Mohrenschildt. So we have a connection here with the Chicago outfit, mafia, George Mohrenschildt, George H.W. Bush, Prescott Bush, William F. Buckley, who you should know that George Mohrenschildt worked as a cohort of William Buckley in Mexico City. William Buckley was working for the CIA at the time, and he was working directly for E. Howard Hunt in Mexico City when George Mohrenschildt was there. George Mohrenschildt and Jean, his last wife, who he continued to live with for 4 years after their divorce, Jean, they toured Guatemala, Mexico City, Caracas, Venezuela, Haiti. And I believe George Mohrenschildt was in Haiti when Jack Kennedy was killed in Dallas. So we're talking about Venezuela, Hampton Oil. William Buckley's family owned Pentapec Oil, which does business with Zapata Oil, which is George Bush, and William F. Buckley, and Edward Hooker, who is an important person in the life of the Bushes and the Murchisons. You should know that George Mohrenschildt founded the Russian Review newspaper in 1941 with money he didn't have. He also funded and raised money for Polish resistance for World War II. And he was associated with Film Facts propaganda production and selling insurance for 3 years without a license and living in Manhattan, New York and Long Island with money he doesn't have and traveling the world and having time to marry and divorce 4 times. So he sounds like a real James Bond spook, doesn't he? This is how Ben Siegel was done away with. Ben Siegel, Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Lino LaBianca, right? And William Colby, who was killed on Hill Road on Rock Point, Maryland, killed in his kitchen halfway through his meal of steamed clams and corn. So this is the situation. Let me do my collage here so that you can see the photographs of what I'm talking about. Let me just hit the pause button and I will be right back with the. Hello, everyone. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to post all my photographs in the show notes below the video post. So do check out all the footnotes and check out my general description of the murder of George de Mohrenschildt, whose original name was von Mohrenschildt. Anyway, he was an intelligence asset his entire career. He was murdered at age 65 in Palm Beach, across the street from the Atlantic Ocean. And I believe his killers came in by boat and were dropped off probably at the neighbor's house to the north. Then they walked over on the property and were allowed in by the maid or Lillian Romantic, the live-in cook, either one of those 2 women, or possibly the landscaper gentleman. Maybe they let the killers onto the property, but somebody in the inner circle of this mansion, which is a gated community, it's on all the homes on 1A1 or have steel gates, and they all back up to the inland waterway system, which does allow for easy escape without having to monkey with the gate or drive a car or possibly be pulled over by the police or the sheriff's department of Palm Beach County. You do know that the sheriff is 100% compromised. The sheriff of Palm Beach County did testify to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, where he said he was 99% certain that George Mohrenschildt committed suicide. Well, listen to what the sheriff said. The sheriff said he's 99% certain, meaning he's uncertain, right? Because certain is 100%. Certain means 100%. And the sheriff said he's 99% certain, which means he doesn't know if it was suicide. But he's trying to create the illusion that it was. And you should know that the next day, on March 30th, George Mohrenschildt was cremated in Boynton Beach for the funeral home. So there was really no autopsy done on him. They ruled that he was killed from a gunshot to his head. That's obvious, right? But in terms of looking to see if he was drugged or doped, that was not done. And he was cremated within 24 hours of his death. That's just like they do with all crimes, they destroy the evidence. And the body of George Mohrenschildt is evidence of a homicide. But no charges were ever made and no arrests were ever made. And it was just ruled a suicide from the get-go. You know, the Jean Mohrenschildt, she told the sheriff's department in an affidavit, she told a lawyer in an affidavit that her husband had 4 previous suicide attempts. What kind of a person would say that? What kind of an ex-wife would say that? And so that was clear. That's what they wanted. And when Nancy Tilton was taken down to the police station a few days later, she brought her lawyer with her, lawyered up, and didn't answer any questions. No record of any transcript of Nancy Tilton. She knew that George Mohrenschildt was going to be killed. Just like George Bush knew Jack Kennedy was going to be killed. George Bush is the CIA director at the time of George Mohrenschildt's murder. He knew he was going to be killed. LBJ knew that John Kennedy was going to be killed in Dallas. Everybody knew. Everybody knew. Okay, I'm not sure if Ruth Paine knew. Ruth Paine's name is Ruth Hyde, Jekyll and Hyde. She had nothing to do with the killing of Jack Kennedy. Okay, and she was the most interviewed witness of the 550 witnesses of the Warren Commission. It was the most irrelevant person. What's relevant about Ruth Paine is how unimportant she is. Her father works for CIA, her mother works for CIA, her husband works for military intelligence for Bell Helicopters. He knows nothing about the murder of Jack Kennedy, and neither does LBJ. He doesn't know anything. Richard Nixon doesn't know anything. George W. Bush, he didn't know nothing about it. He's not involved in the killing, except to know that there's a cocktail party where we're going to celebrate the murder of the president, and you're invited. So they knew it was going to happen. They didn't necessarily know where the shooters were going to be, and they didn't know exactly, what time it was going to happen. But it became obvious once you were in Dealey Plaza after noontime. Most of the witnesses there all worked for military intelligence. There really were no actual legitimate witnesses that told you anything. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video, and like and share. I am heavily shadow banned. Take care now. Bye-bye.